everyone, and welcome to this history revision video focusing on African American civil rights during the major wars, so that's World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. So starting with World War I, due to the high rate of industrial jobs going in the north, over 500,000 African Americans moved to the north during World War I, and this meant that they were more likely to vote as there was less disenfranchisement in the north, although there were still quite a few racist restrictions. Some also started to get involved in political activity. Also, those African American men who joined the army were more assertive about their civil rights, and due to the increased African American communities in the northern cities, this meant a greater need for black newspapers and black media. In terms of economic position, World War I was very beneficial for those living in the north, as there were better job opportunities with higher wages, and 500,000 escaped the south to the better paid industrial jobs in the north. Also, the restriction of European immigration meant that they were more likely to hire African Americans, and they could fill the jobs that had been left by the white men who had joined the army, so there were just great employment opportunities in the north. However, this all meant that there was an increase in racist violence at the end of the war, as when all the white men returned and found that their jobs had been taken, there was a lot of tension, and this led to the 1919 Red Summer riots, where hundreds of African Americans were killed because jobs in neighborhoods were filled by African Americans who were willing to work for lower wages. Now moving on to World War II, in terms of political rights, the only real gain that happened was the Smith versus Allwright judgment in 1944, and this was the Supreme Court banning all-white primary elections, so basically banning elections where black people weren't allowed to vote. In terms of economic position, it's arguable that World War II was a big turning point for African Americans. Black unemployment in 1945 was 16% of its 1940 level, so this meant that the level of those who were unemployed had dramatically decreased, and this was mainly due to the mass migration north for the better job opportunities. In 1941, 75% of African American women worked in domestic service, but by the end of the war, it was less than half of African American women. And overall, World War II had a long-lasting effect, as employment remained high after the war ended with the post-war economic boom. Migration also continued, and by the 1960s, most African Americans lived in the north. But although these benefits were significant and long-lasting, they still were nothing compared to the amount that white people were benefiting from the post-war boom. Activism also began to increase during World War II with the Double V campaign, calling for a double victory over racism in Europe and also at home in the USA. Soldiers who had experienced the liberal racial attitudes in Europe were more determined to challenge it once they returned home to America. In 1941, the Fair Employment Committee was set up in response to the threat of a march on Washington, so activism was having an effect on the federal government. NAACP membership also quadrupled during the war. However, segregation and just general racial tension continued. Finally, the Vietnam War. In terms of political rights, this war became a black issue, and this was because African Americans were much more likely to be conscripted to the war, and they were more likely to be killed as they were disproportionately being put in dangerous positions in Vietnam. The Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers actively campaigned against the war, and they were both Black Power groups. Martin Luther King also opposed the war, and this lost him the critical white support that made him so popular, including President Lyndon B. Johnson. So overall, the war divided the black civil rights movement and also increased racial tension in the army, as many black soldiers were becoming radicalized by Black Power. Economically, the war had a negative effect, as the federal government had to divert funds from LBJ's Great Society program in order to fund the war. The Great Society program was created in order to reduce black poverty and decrease educational segregation, so it was a social welfare program designed for African Americans, but it lost federal funding because of the war, and that's what turned Martin Luther King against the war.